movements are waving the way. A revolution of honesty will cut through the lies. As the world turns its gaze, a new dawn will rise. So gather the voices who waited too long. Ready or crying, we'll sing out strong. His freedom's a fire, lighting up the gloom. As the massive, triumphant clock brings truth to the room. In the shadows of a house where the whispers play, the door of the frame holds the secrets of the day. Locked on to Eddie, they whispered his name. Caught in a tempest, a life gone insane. Down in the dark, where the cellar path runs, a set of keys hit the dirt under disappearing suns. A house key, a car key, lost in the rush. But the state swept it up like a hand in the crush. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through the darkness, piercing the shroud. 30 years in chains, but the truth won't die. Unseal the past, let Eddie rise high. Unseal the notes, expose all the blocks. Rayleigh trapped Eddie in a manufactured box. 30 years of hidden facts buried in the track. It is time to give Eddie O'Brien his freedom back. Unseal the box, break down the lock. Let the truth ring louder than the courthouse clock. 3 decades of silence, a cold prison shell. Refuse to lie, they cast a wicked spell. No remorse in their eyes, they judge from the booth. But
What's going on, everybody? How we doing today, man? We rocking out, man. Another chapter. We're gonna get into the politics of murder. And Trevor putting the name of this up on Facebook. So it might take it down, but
in a world of black and white, we lost
oh
the
yeah,
shade.
let's
Judges
go.
made with no thought, no faith in what could be said. Every expert that came said the same refrain.
What's going on, everybody, today, man? Beautiful, beautiful day. How we all doing? Beautiful Sunday.
Through the pain. Nah, the danger to the world, just a kid with a dream. They top the wounds and scars like it's part of
You're free, Eddie. Share this. Hit the like button, man. Less than 10% of people are hitting the like button. Come on, people. Hit the like button so people can see these episodes.
They knew the facts, non-violent heart. It's not an act. He was meant for healing, not this dark fate. But the court turned blind. Conceal sealed up the gate. Oh, oh, he sealed up the gate. With every test and interview, they painted his soul, but that didn't matter. They had lost control. They looked at a number, not the man within, ignoring all the voices that should have helped him win. The purpose of the hearing was to guide him through, yet they tossed the science like they never knew. Too dangerous, too damaged, oh, that's not who he was. Just a child in a system without a pause. Every single expert, they knew the facts. Non-violent heart, it's not an act. He was meant for healing, not this dark fate, but the court turned blind and sealed up the gate. Oh, they focused on the wounds as if pain could define the essence of a kid who's meant to shine. A constitutional failure right before our eyes, lost in the shuffle where justice dies. America, can you see? Can you open the door to the voices unheard? Fighting for more. Every single expert, they knew the facts. Non-violent heart, it's not an act. He was meant for healing, not this dark fate, but the court turned blind and sealed up the gate. Eddie's story is a lesson, not just for today. A reminder to listen, to show a better way. When the voices of the many are ignored with disdain, we've lost the battle and it's all in vain. Let the echoes of the experts ring loud and clear. For every Eddie standing there.
Oh, what's going on, man? For every Eddie standing there, because we know Eddie's not alone. You know, we know everyone. We know prison isn't filled of innocent people, but a lot of people are guilty there. But that don't mean we forget about the innocent people. Something that Jojo said yesterday. I like that, and he was absolutely right. You know, yes, not everyone in prison is innocent. You know, a lot of them are guilty, but there is a lot of people. There are people in there that are also innocent. And what's going on, everybody, today? You know, I think we're getting a lot of information out these last couple of weeks about Eddie O'Brien. You know, and today we go into chapter 9. You know, what did the Commonwealth know? You know, and shout out to Margo Nash, you know, for putting all these words in the book and not being afraid to ask the hard questions. You know, what did they know? And when did they know it? You know, but today we're going to break it down. What's going on, everybody? Shout out to all the great mods and everybody that's joining us today. At Patricia White, hello. The kind Okalala, you know, reading cards, you know. Blue Moon has blessed us with another beautiful morning yet today. Yeah, the moon was bright last night. Good morning at Patricia White. Joseph Burho, shout out to Jojo in the house. You know, one of our great Saturday guests, it seems. You know, maybe we got to give Jojo a regular Saturday spot. You know, maybe a lot of people would like to hear Jojo's life story. You know, we'll have to break that down, though. You know, a couple episodes, but shout out to Jojo. You know, and then maybe we'll get some other people on here, you know, other guys that know the system, maybe other guys that know Eddie, you know, if they're comfortable talking, because I think people need to hear, you know, who who Eddie is, absolutely, man. Let's see who else. Who else we have? At Courtney, shout out to Courtney, big, big fan of Courtney's work. Shout out to Courtney, always hanging out in the chat. Glad to be here with everyone on this beautiful day. Shout out to you. There's so many dedicated people here. I'm a fan of you guys. I'm a fan of all you guys. Shout out to Miss Luscious, gifted us 10 memberships yesterday. That's what's up. Appreciate that. Great mods in the chat, and don't forget, hype up them videos, hype up the videos. We're gonna have a mod, I think, stream pretty soon where I'll get all the mods and we can see what we can do to make this shit better. And shout out to Denise, Denise No 43 should be back from her cruise pretty soon. And Aunt G, Aunt Gerald, man. Hi, chat, free Eddie. Wifey's in the kitchen with the grandkids and my daughter. Chilling on the cruise, huh? How is that cruise? But yeah, so we get all that out the way. We're gonna get into chapter 9. Maybe we could break down the evidence the Commonwealth had, the evidence that they ignored, the evidence the Commonwealth buried, and the evidence that should have cleared 15-year-old boy from day one. And I'm hoping more people are convinced now that we've been kind of going over a lot of the DNA work. We went over the blood work. We went over about how the officer came back to the scene with blood. Like, who does that? The shoddy police work. We basically been breaking it all down. A lot of people heard the episodes of Adi Ortiz, and then we heard Eddie O'Brien's episode, and we heard about what happened in the house, which a lot of people, we didn't really know what happened, but we heard, Margo Nash explain it, so I think so far it's been a great book. We heard about how the juvenile, the hearing is, and with the Mackenzie case, they have a bind over hearing, but I think the presumption is less in Ohio on the bind over hearing, but a little different than the juvenile hearing. But I'm sure every state has their own protocol for that. But shout out to the mods out there, shout out to all the members, shout out to everybody that gives the memberships. I really appreciate that. The whole chat family, because I think our chat is family, right? So thank you to the family for riding with us through every chapter. This isn't just a book reading. I never really done this before. This is a case study, in how a system can fail is what I'm getting out of the Margo Nash book, and how a community refuses to let the truth die. So we got to get locked in, for this episode. I think, chapter 9. I'm excited. We went over chapter 8 yesterday. We always hear people say that the justice system is broken. How many people are really just finding out that the justice system does this? Is there people that are like, I didn't realize that this stuff really went on? Because a lot of people are numb to it. A lot of people have no idea. Oh, thank you for the $9.99. Home is where the heart is. Absolutely appreciate that. And we have some loyal people that come back every day for our streams, and I appreciate that. And I just want to push this message for Eddie, really, to get Eddie out, because seeing what Eddie's been through, it broke a piece of me. I became broken. And I said, you know what, why can't I help maybe tell people, why I think Eddie is innocent? And I think going over a lot of this court work, a lot of this paperwork, we got so much more coming. So we have stuff that no one ever seen before coming. So we have a lot of information coming. June is right here upon us. The Rule 30 is coming very, very soon. But yep, so we're gonna have some new information that nobody has seen except maybe Little Ed O'Brien and his attorneys, but we're gonna be the first to get it. So, which is exciting, so we can break that down to you. But we hear people say that the justice system's broken. I'll settle for getting Eddie. Absolutely. I'm happy to be back with no Wi-Fi interruptions. Nice. And I'll tell you what, man, give it up to JoJo, man. To have a friend like that, for Eddie to have a friend like that, I mean, I know what it's like to be inside and even think about having a friend, but to really have a friend that will stand by you. And when that phone rings or when that friend needs something, and JoJo for 20 years has not seen his friend, and JoJo is still ride or die with Eddie O'Brien. I mean, that is a friend that we all wish we can have because, friends are hard to come by, and really, you find out one day that you can only count on one hand. So shout out to JoJo for being a real friend to Eddie O'Brien, man. That is something else. It is. It's just, it's you almost don't even know what to say. But and JoJo tells us how the system's broken. And as we read this book together, the more it's clear it ain't broken. You know what? The system isn't broken. We think it's broken, but to them, it's working exactly how they designed it to work. How many men and women are sitting in cells right now? Innocent people, forgotten people, or sacrificed for somebody else's ambition. How many times has that happened? We see it with Karen Reed. We see it with Eddie O'Brien, Bennett. How many other people along the way have we seen it happen to? How many families, get their lives flipped upside down because the truth was not convenient? Mikey, my mother always said, put your hand out. If you can have one true friend, you are blessed. Absolutely. Your mother was a very smart woman on G. But yeah, just to have one friend, and JoJo, definitely is that friend to Eddie. For 20 years, JoJo's been standing by Eddie's side. My voice was loud on the cruise. I had so many people listening from Massachusetts on that ship. It was great to answer questions, made lots of new acquaintances to join the page. Absolutely excellent, I'm in it to win it. That's right. JoJo is Eddie's living angel, absolutely. And I see that picture of the guys running out of courthouse, after a victory. I could see, just Eddie coming out, just smiling ear to ear, man. But there are a lot of people that their families, their lives get flipped upside down, because the truth wasn't convenient at the time. You get guys like Little Eve O'Reilly all over the country. How many kids like Eddie never got a chance? I think in Mass, I think I read up to 60 kids, ended up getting screwed over by the super predator BS that was going around, and I think that's why chapter 9 might hit a little different because chapter 9 asks questions that the Commonwealth never wanted to answer, right? What did they know? What did they choose to ignore? but I'm going to shut up. We're going to dive into this, but thank you again, Margo Nash, for allowing me to bring this book to the people, for writing this book what others were afraid to say out loud. Big shout out to the O'Brien family, big shout out to JoJo, all the O'Briens holding it down, the whole family for having the courage, the patience, and the trust to help let me, carry Eddie's story forward. That's not something I take lightly. I really, really appreciate that. My condolences go out to Ed O'Brien for his loss, so big shout out to Big Ed, big shout out to the mods, the members, everybody in the chat. I just have to be so grateful to all of you, man. Because y'all show up all the time with your hearts open and you're like, will you shut up and just read the book? All right, so we're going to get into the book right now. All right, what else can I say? Read the damn book, Mike. Chapter 9, What the Commonwealth Knew. Trial testimony will reveal that Eddie became a person of interest in Janet Downing's murder the moment he reported the mugging. The police made him their prime suspect after interviewing him that night, seizing his clothes and sneakers, photographing and fingerprinting him. They arrested him just 38 hours later. And remember, they didn't even have a motive. They didn't even have a motive. We seen that yesterday. That was crazy. They didn't have a motive for what, a couple weeks? I never heard of that. What's the motive? I don't know. We'll figure it out. Like I said, reverse profile. What evidence against Eddie O'Brien did the Commonwealth have on July 25th, 1995, before they arrested him? Eyewitnesses. Oh, and these boys, man, yo. These boys, let me tell you. I like to have a few choice words for these, lies. Straight up lies. Three boys, friends of Eddie and Ryan, had gone to Ryan's house at approximately 9:20 p.m. to see if Ryan was home yet. Marco Abreu, Seth Dion, and John Fitzpatrick knocked on the front door, but got no answer. The front door was ajar, but the inner door to the house was closed. Seth went to the back door on the deck and got no answer. Marco, standing in the backyard, noticed the cellar door was wide open. Just then, they heard a rustle in the bushes and saw a 6'2", 220-pound white male jump onto Hamlet Street and continue walking down the hill. Marco called to him, "Hey, Ed, nice hiding place, Ed." Their accounts varied to whether or not this person turned to look at them, but none of the boys positively identified the man as Eddie O'Brien. Marco said he saw the man smile but couldn't be 100% sure. He didn't positively identify Eddie until after Eddie's arrest. Imagine that. He didn't, say, 100% sure that was Eddie. He didn't tell the cop that was Eddie. And then when they went down to the store, he didn't say to Eddie, "Yo, you're friggin' lying. I just seen you." He didn't say that till after Eddie's arrest, till after he went and had a conversation in the driveway with Ed's dad. I don't know. It seems to me that once he was told not to come around the house anymore, his story changed. And it's kind of like, "Hey, kid, maybe it was, are you sure it wasn't Eddie?" "Yeah, I think it was Eddie, kid. Just say it was Eddie." And then his story changes. I don't believe it. Kid lied several times. John said the man never stopped and continued walking, despite the lack of positive identification. The district attorney believed he had eyewitnesses who put Eddie O'Brien at the scene of the crime. Of course he did. The police found a piece of metal they believed to be the hilt of a small pocket knife in the shag carpet of the third stair in the Downing home. They never found a murder weapon. Imagine. In the short distance that Eddie went, they didn't find a murder weapon. They didn't find no bloody clothes. They didn't find no big puddles of blood anywhere. They went to Burger King, didn't find nothing. Over here, go. The hilt was found similar to a small green knife Eddie owned. The green knife had a matching red knife. Eddie found the knives while cleaning out the attic when his grandfather was in the hospital that June and brought them over to the Downing home to show his friends. Eddie also brought the green knife into Midnight Convenience to show one of the clerks, Jack Arnold, coincidentally, also a court officer in the Somerville District Court the night before the crime. The clerk said he noticed that the hilt was loose. Eddie left the knife at midnight that Saturday night with Jack Arnold. The green knife was never found. So the alleged murder weapon, they never found the weapon. Hey, welcome. Shout out Law Talkers, in the house. Appreciate you. On G. Imagine that. It's funny. I had to go to prison, find one of the best and loyal friends, someone that has been a positive influence in my life and healthy love from his family. Imagine that. It's crazy where you find loyalty. One of the darkest places around. It's a great comment right there. Fingerprints now. Eddie O'Brien's left thumb index print and middle fingerprints were found on the post at the foot of the cellar staircase. Prints from his right index finger and right middle finger were found on the inside of the interior front door, above the front handle. The district attorney had Eddie's fingerprints at the scene of the crime. That is it. The only hard evidence implicating Eddie O'Brien as the perpetrator of the horrific murder of his best friend's mother that the district attorney had before arresting Eddie. Imagine that, just some fingerprints in the house. Like, all right, he was in the house. We ain't denying that. He was in the house. So his fingerprints would be in the house. No blood testing had been done yet, and Marco Abreu had not yet changed his story to being 100% sure it was Eddie he saw. No comparison had been done between the metal piece and any similar knife. So all they had was some smudge-ass fingerprints, and they said it was Eddie O'Brien. Arrest his ass. No motive. No motive. You read all this, and you're kind of like, what was Bob George up to? Like, how could he not? I don't know. This is nuts. And the fix had to be it. I mean, because this is just plain in English, like reasonable doubt all over it. The Commonwealth eventually learned that Eddie had indeed been inside the Downing house that night and that he said he had seen the perpetrator. But that wasn't until they learned from the defense team about Eddie's interview with Dr. Paul Spires. Eddie had been in custody for at least 2 weeks when he wrote a note in mid-August to his attorney, Ralph Camper, telling him that he'd been in the house and seen the attacker. His attorney arranged for Eddie to undergo a forensic interview under the influence of sodium amytal, so-called truth serum, by Dr. Spires, like a lie detector test. This is a useful tool in gathering additional information or corroborating known information, but it is not admissible at trial, like a lie detector test. It is not considered scientifically reliable. I think it's more reliable than a damn jury. I'm kind of glad they don't have that. But I think that Amatol test is more reliable than a jury, for someone under. Did you do it? Yes, no, all right, lock him up. The test indicated that Eddie was being truthful about what happened to him that night. Again, the sodium amytal test, Eddie, a 15-year-old, clean system. They whack him out on benzos, and they get him all kind of beans, and where he's lit. He's out of it. Eyes rolled in the back of his head. The test indicates that Eddie was being truthful about what happened to him that night. The report was shared with the district attorney, notwithstanding the test or the fact that Eddie had no detectable blood on his clothing, on his sneakers, on his hands, under his fingernails, right after the crime, and had been wearing the same clothes all day. The Commonwealth proceeded to build its case around Eddie O'Brien to be the exclusion of any possible suspect. For him to commit a crime like that with all of them wounds, blood, he would have been covered in blood everywhere. No way would he be able to wash it all out, even if he changed clothes. He would have more than a drop on his knee. I mean, everybody should be convinced of his innocence by now. And I'm even thinking, and I'm sure the other side, once that seed is planted, come on, man, unless there's some seriously some stuff going on that the other side knows that, like, absolutely who did it, like, they have to have wonder over the last 30 years. You think Ed really did that? They had to have that conversation. They just don't want to believe it themselves. And I could see that. They don't want to open them wounds, which we will get into that a little bit after. But the test indicates that Eddie was being truthful about what happened that night. What do y'all think about that sodium amytal test? Do you think Eddie could lie under that? Those rotten lawyers not getting expert witnesses and all DNA. Wouldn't even give it up. Wouldn't even allow it to be tested. Yep, wearing the same clothes all day, and he would be covered in blood. And this isn't your regular blood, like a bloody nose. Exactly. Eddie told the truth. He could not lie on a sodium amytal test. You cannot lie on that shit. Eddie never changed the truth. Absolutely. You cannot lie on that stuff. They've been using that stuff. The CIA been using that. I'm sure it goes back to Hitler was using it. You just can't lie on a sodium amytal test. There is just no, no way you're gonna lie on that shit. The report was shared with the district attorney, notwithstanding the test or the fact that Eddie had no detectable blood on his clothes, sneakers, hands, or under his fingernails right after the crime, and it had been wearing the same clothes all day. The Commonwealth proceeded to build its case around Eddie O'Brien to the exclusion of any other possible suspects. The DA knew that the Reckleys, Janet Downing's Commonwealth neighbors, had heard a sound that could have been someone falling down the stairs at exactly 8:15 p.m. Investigators knew that part of what they believed was the murder weapon, and blood was found on the lower 5 steps of the staircase. They knew that there was almost no water pressure at the Reckley's home at 9 o'clock. They knew that this often happened if the water was running at Downing's house. They knew that Downing's water was still running at 9 o'clock. Eddie had an alibi at 9 o'clock, didn't he? All right, give me a minute. Got to handle some business. Be right back. Let me all know what you think about the sodium test, about Eddie not having any blood on him. And you would have, and this is that nasty blood. This is that tissuey blood, that real, that nasty, nasty blood, like thick stuff. So it would be covered. He would be covered in it. I'll be right back.
For every Eddie standing there, we cannot disappear. shuffle where justice dies. America, can you see? Can you open the door to the voices unheard? Fighting for more. Every single expert, they knew the facts. up the gate. Eddie's story is a lesson, not just for today. A reminder to listen, to show a better way. When the voices of the many are ignored with disdain, we've lost the battle and it's all in vain. Let the echoes of the experts ring loud and clear. For every Eddie stand.
All right, we back, man. We're talking about the sodium amytal, test that Eddie took. Eddie being 15 years old, injured, medicated, exhausted, traumatized when he took this test. I think it was not soon after he was locked up. And he took a polygraph test, right? Passed it. He took a sodium amytal interview, passed it. The combination is really unusual, especially for a juvenile. So, I mean, no way a juvenile is going to pass both of them tests and research it. I mean, yes, they say it's not reliable because courts don't see it admissible. But, as far as getting information out of people, the CIA had used it for years. I think even going back as far as Hitler had used it. So despite Eddie being sedated, right, he's in pain, right, he's under a lot of stress, you know what I mean, and not fully aware of his surroundings. And Eddie passed both tests, not one test, he passed both tests. Let that sink in. A child, not anybody trained for this, drugged, stitched up. He passes a lie detector test and the truth serum interview on top of everything else, on top of the DNA evidence that there was someone else's DNA in the house. Her AB blood was not on Eddie. He had a little drop on his knee when he said he bent down, rolled her over to see if she was okay. He said that in the amytal test. And I think if he was lying, these conditions would have made it easier to catch him, but he told the truth then, but the test was problematic. Using the amytal on a minor raises a lot of concerns, I think, ethical concerns, medical concerns, right? Legal concerns. Did they have permission? I think Eddie was all cool with it because he wanted to prove his innocence. I mean, the reliability concerns, I mean, they knew it would not be admissible, but I think everybody wanted to know. And I think the judge and the other side really thought that it was going to come out that, yep, he did it. So even after that test, a 15-year-old in that condition cannot meaningfully consent, right? And the result, I don't think the results can be even trusted. Why was it done? They ain't going to accept the test. They ain't going to trust it. I mean, that's the question that still hangs over this case. Why did you do the test? Because you thought it was going to come up that he did it. And you would have definitely used the results then, even though they wouldn't be admissible, but you would still read them to the jury. The outcome's still striking. Even people say, that, they can't use the test in court. The outcome still has to say something. But the jury, I don't think even got a chance to know about that either. Eddie didn't confess. He didn't break in that test. He didn't contradict himself from the information I found. He didn't reveal any hidden guilt. He didn't say where there was a murder weapon or anything. He remained consistent, even under being whacked out of his mind. And for a lot of people, I think that studied this case, that fact alone raises doubts about the narrative that Riley and the Commonwealth pushes. After you hear about the polygraph test, the sodium amytal test, the DNA, I don't understand what more people really still would need, but there's going to be a lot more coming in the Rule 30 motion. But the sodium amytal test, I think, is very important, right? Because it shows, right, investigators were willing to use extraordinary questionable methods to prove that this kid was a killer. They couldn't do it. It worked against them, right? Eddie was tested in a way, right, that I don't think any other juvenile suspect would ever be tested. And I would like to ask Margo Nash this: was there ever another juvenile that was tested with sodium amytal? Or maybe if someone else may know that. But even under these conditions, Eddie didn't show deception, right? And the results were ignored, because it didn't fit the prosecution's theory. I'm glad when the sodium amytal shit came up. Like, this is something that I've been like really, really like reading up on and studying, because this is one of the keys that I went with when I was deciding, Eddie's innocent or guilt. And this test was really, really big for me. This is one of the many reasons that I was sticking with Eddie was not guilty of this. But this has to be one of the many things that people have to question about the integrity of the investigation. You drugged up a 15-year-old kid to get what you wanted, but it didn't work out, and you didn't even use the results. You didn't even talk about the results, even though they're inadmissible. Good morning, Trish. We're talking about the sodium amytal test. Good morning, Ed. I don't know how much you heard that about the sodium amytal test that I was talking about. And I said that was one of the keys that I used about, me deciding that Ed, was innocent of this. And it really showed how desperate and biased the investigation had really become. It took drugging a 15-year-old boy, traumatized, past a truth serum interview and a polygraph test, the DNA. What else do people really need to hear? And the state still pushed forward as if none of it even mattered. That was definitely tunnel vision, and I think that test was really, really, that was big to me. That was really big in me deciding, because no way he's passing that test. I'll see if I can get another copy of the video, but when we watched the other video over on JFK show, he was out of it. He was definitely whacked out of it, and no way he would have been able to. I don't see any way he would have been able to get by that, but let's get back into this. They just talked to Eddie. Visits are canceled, and he is locked down as they found a god deceased from natural causes. Wow. God deceased from natural causes. That God, imagine that. They canceled. They locked that shit down for anything, man. Like God shortage, this, that, Christmas parties. And I'm sure they just sit back, watch his TV. They have, what's he has TV in his cell, I assume, right? I'm sure he's got a TV. He's got a tablet. That's cool. Shit, when I went to jail, right? You were doing everything by pen. There was no damn computers there. But yeah, so we're talking about the sodium amytal test. I figured I'd just break it down, explain to people what the sodium amytal test was, how they went about it, and all that other stuff. Let me see, where was I? Yeah. They knew there was almost no water pressure at the Reckley's home at 9 o'clock. They knew that this often happened if the water was running at Downing's house. They knew that Downing's water was still running full force in the powder room when the first responders arrived at the scene at 10 o'clock. They knew Eddie O'Brien was at home in his own house between 8:15 and 9:15 that night. The testimony of the Commonwealth's own witness, Marco Abreu, said Theon, John Fitzpatrick, and Michelle Cameron made it impossible for Eddie to have committed the slaying within the time frame available to him. The testimony of the coroner alone illustrated the enormous amount of time the criminal spent with Janet Downing, struggling across 3 rooms in the stairway, beating her, killing her, undressing her, redressing her, and then inflicting post-mortem wounds. The window of opportunity for Eddie would have been between 9:15, when he was known to have left his house, and about 9:20, after the boys knocked and saw someone jumping out the bushes. 5 minutes to do all of that and stay spickety clean. 5 minutes. And like I said, your arm is elevated above your heart. Your arm is going to get tired. Blood is going to rush, to your heart. You're going to get no way. Eddie didn't do this. He didn't have that kind. No way you could do all of that in 5 minutes and not get nothing on you, and run out the back door and crash through bushes and scale fences and all the crazy things that people are saying. Impossible, and so much reasonable doubt. The time frame, no way, across all the rooms, the stairway, the place was a mess. He would have been a mess, with a 5 minute window of opportunity. No. When the boys knocked and saw someone jumping out the bushes, District Attorney Tom Riley himself was present during the witness interviews the morning after the crime. Riley's CPAC unit taking over the case from the Somerville police at about 2:30 in the morning, just hours after the crime. Decisions had already been made about how this investigation would proceed. Who told the troopers not to interview the Reckleys? Why weren't they interviewed until 2 years after the crime? Was it because their observation completely conflicted with what little evidence the Commonwealth had against Eddie? Every prosecutorial decision made along the long legal journey in this case placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of a 15-year-old boy, to the exclusion of any other possible suspects. It appeared that no one else was ever seriously considered as a possible suspect. Eddie had to be guilty. Tom Riley's credibility and career depended on it. How can this kid not get a new Rule 30 after all this? Like everything. And I'm sure the Rule 30 is going to be this and then some. But boy, man, what a system. And that brings us in chapter 10, the decision. You know, what a crazy, crazy system that they had going on back then in 1996, man. Oh, I mean, we always hear people say, like I said, the justice system's broken. You know, men and women locked up, sitting in these damn cages. You know, unbelievable. And you know who was the predecessor? Prosecutor Wayne Bud. They all have these connections. You know, some of y'all will probably know the name Bud. Riley ended up becoming, attorney general. But if you really want to understand, because the super predator era, which connects to all of this, this is how they got everybody afraid as to everything going on. The super predator law was heading to mass, and you got to understand, but the early 90s, mass, a lot of states, especially in New England, were in full panic mode, especially Massachusetts, when a horrific homicide hit the news, right? The lawyers all rushed to rewrite all these juvenile laws, but they don't put no thought into them. They are not responsible with them. You know what I mean? They're just like, what are they doing? And right in the middle of this shitstorm, you got Wayne Bud, and we have the song about him, he wasn't just any damn prosecutor, you know, he was the United States Attorney for Massachusetts, and he was advising at the time Governor Bill Weld, right? Yes, the same Weld he followed into that office, right? And there's a Riley connection here as well. They were a political machine, and they were the machine, that got Eddie locked the hell up, and they were the guys that climbed Eddie's back all the way where they had to go. Bud was the one who told Weld, appoint a black district attorney in Suffolk County or risk an LA style riots for Rodney King, right? So Bud Weld appoints Ralph Martin, right? 39-year-old, relatively unknown lawyer, who basically switched his shit to Republican the day he got the damn job. So where does Ralph Martin come from? And it's all ties in. I know the political shit is kind of like boring, but it all ties in. See, Bud and Riley, yes, that Riley, Tom Riley, yep, the Middlesex DA who would later prosecute Eddie O'Brien, that guy. See, this wasn't coincidence. See, they were putting this together way before. Eddie just fell into their web. But Bud, Riley, their life is, and where it gets real, Wayne Bud wasn't just a colleague of Tom Riley from the research that I ended up doing. He was a lifelong friend. He was his mentor. Here we go, another mentor. His campaign manager. They were law partners. So these two moved through the system up there in Boston, like there was a match set. So when Tom Riley, when he took over the Eddie O'Brien case in 95, oh, well, how does Kevin K say it? By design, a system by design, or, but something he did for none of the other cases, and we went over that, during his tenure. He wasn't walking in alone. He was walking in with decades of muscle behind him. And Riley knew that. In Eddie's case, it's the perfect political stage. So Margo says in the beginning, I couldn't protect Eddie. You know, the law couldn't protect Eddie. The judge couldn't protect Eddie. Nothing could protect Eddie. But now it's a little different. You know, so Riley, backed by the Bud Network, right, pushed the idea that the kids were becoming super predators and we have to make harsher laws. So you needed all these pieces in order to make this work, right? And it did work out because Eddie's conviction ended up becoming a catalyst for that damn law, and it ended up sending children to adult prison for life without parole. I think up to 60 of these damn kids. You know, a mandatory minimum sentence so extreme that back in 2015, the United States Supreme Court ruled it's unconstitutional for juveniles. But by then, the damage is done. You got guys 30, 40 years. You look at all the time that Eddies are already doing. You know, the irony, right? But yeah, reform guy. Now let's fast forward to 2016, right? Wayne Bud, he writes some shit in the Boston Globe, right? What the hell was it? He wrote some shit in the Boston Globe calling for criminal justice reform, right? Criticizing, you know, minimum sentences or some shit, right? And here's the thing. The minimum sentences and with real tough, you know, laws for kids, they went tough on. They had this big tough on crime organization, you know, a big wave. You know, him, Tom Riley, they all helped. They were the architects of a very system that he later claimed to be against. And until he acknowledges that, as the article says, you know, I mean, it was, I don't know, it was kind of crazy. You know, so who was Wayne Bud? I mean, absolutely, I would say a super predator power broker. Big in politics. He had a lot of influence that shaped the lives that destroyed Eddie's life. He's a man that helped create this system that destroyed the O'Brien's family. And if you understand him, you can understand how the machine ended up working. And the machine is still going today. But if we don't name the architects, right? If we don't know where the boss is, if we don't know where Nino Brown is, then we can't take down the Carter, can we? We can't dismantle this building. You know what I mean? I mean, seriously. I'll be right back.
Let me tell you about a kid, only 15 years. Eddie O'Brien, caught in the gears. Political pawns, they played their game. Power and money all in his name. But was tight with wealth, no simple fake. Climbed the ladder, sealed Eddie's state. Wayne Bud, a prosecutor with a purpose. In the court of politics, none could touch us. This ain't just a story, it's a legacy. Eddie was the stone that shaped their destiny. With every connection, every hand they shake, Eddie's case became the ground they break. Riley and Bud, best friends. friends since youth. Built a law firm, they spun the truth. When Riley took the case, he was never alone. Built on foundations, powerfully grown. With the Budwell Network, they made a show. Charlie Baker in the mix, he's part of the flow. All linked together, climbing the heights. On Eddie's back, they rose to new sights. This ain't just a story, it's a legacy. Eddie was a stone that shaped their destiny. With every connection, every hand they shake, Eddie's case became the ground they break. Kimberly Budd, her name now in lights. Chief Justice of the Court in the highest of fights. Calls Riley godfather, mentor, uncle too. Let that sink in deep. Eddie's pain paved through. Judge Heffernan ruled fair, you played your part. But the pressure came down like a storm in the dark. It wasn't about truth, wasn't about rights. It was all about power and their political heights. This ain't just a story, it's a legacy. Eddie was the stone that shaped their destiny. With every connection, every hand they shake, Eddie's case became the ground they break. Eddie got used by a system so cruel. A pawn on the chessboard, they played him as a fool. So remember his name, let it echo, let it be free. Eddie till it's backwards. Fight for the right you see. Can we keep it real honest? Let the truth ignite. We don't bend, we don't break. We will stand for the light.
All right, we back. I hope I'm doing a good job explaining it. And I hope I'm correct. I don't want to be telling you some wrong shit, you know. I hope I'm correct, you know. I think I am. I'm 89.9% correct. I think I am, you know, but I believe I am. Rest in peace, Janet. Yeah, I put that question up there. Did Janet Downing get justice? Absolutely. Free Eddie, you know. Rest in peace, Janet. You know, but I think one of the most painful truths in this entire story is I need to clear my throat to talk about that. Because this isn't about sides. You know, this isn't about picking sides. This is about, you know, damn, this is crazy. You know, this is about Janet Downing, you know, a woman who deserved better than I think what Janet got. But Eddie O'Brien didn't get justice either, you know. But after, you know, going through some of the transcripts, the reports, you know, some of the forensic files, you know, the breakdown from, you know, from Margo's book, from Margo's site, you know, one thing is painfully, I think, obvious. Janet Downing did not get the investigation she deserved. She didn't get the investigation she wanted, and she knew this was coming. Janet Downing seen this coming earlier that day. If they would have just talked to, you know, Regina, the person that was with Janet the last 10 hours, you know, the last 10 hours, you know, maybe they would have known, but that didn't fit. That didn't fit their narrative. You know, we got to call it what it is. The state wasn't focused on finding who did that to Janet. She didn't get the investigation she deserved. Absolutely. They seemed focused on getting a conviction fast. They seemed focused on changing the law. And Eddie was the perfect tool. He was the piece to their puzzle. And convincing the public, right, that the person they arrested was the right one was easy. They just made him into a monster. Because I explained it the other day. Some think there might have been even a serial killer running around there. Middlesex County was drowning in unsolved homicides. You had seven. You had seven, and they did not deserve Riley's attention, I guess, according to him. But Janet's did. The unsolved. That's bad for business when you're a district attorney, isn't it, Riley? I mean, everyone else was watching it. I mean, Paul pops up on my feed now. Ryan pops up on my feed. So I'm sure Riley's watching it too. I mean, but under DA Tom Riley, right? Two high-profile crimes were unsolved. Two, the high-profile ones, you know? How about the other names? How about Mary Jo Frugg? You know, she was poked in Cambridge in 91. That was never solved. Deanna Kremlin, the other, more popular one. Strangled in Somerville. Never solved. Both families still don't have answers. Right? And then just 4 months after Deanna, Janet Downing is murdered, right? So the pressure got even bigger for that little creep. The pressure got even bigger. And the city was on edge, and Riley needed a win, and Eddie was a super win for him, and they rushed it, and they didn't care because they were just going to reverse profile the kid. Now, when you talk about the evidence that they didn't want to talk about, right? Eddie O'Brien's fingerprints was found at the scene, right? But here's what they didn't highlight, right? There were other fingerprints also. There was other bloody fingerprints also. There was a bloody palm print. And guess what? It wasn't Janet's. It wasn't Eddie's. It wasn't anyone in the Downing household, right? A stranger's print? Oh, maybe? That's not reasonable doubt either. And then there's the DNA. So anybody that's in doubt, please let them hear this. Then there's the DNA on the alleged murder weapon that's not Eddie's DNA. So explain to me how this man is doing 30 years in prison. Oh, wait a minute. Let's not stop there. How about the DNA under Janet's fingernails? Guess what? That's not friggin' Eddie's either. That's not Eddie's DNA either. So the fingernails, not Eddie. The alleged weapon, not Eddie. If this were any other case, that would stop the investigation cold, no? Would that trigger a full forensic review? Would that send detectives back? Like, go back and look, like Todd McGill said, you don't stop investigating. You continue to investigate. Maybe you should have did what Janet wanted. Investigate. But the truth wasn't their prize. The goal was closure. You know what I mean? And what did Janet ask for? And this part breaks my heart every time. What did Janet ask for? Give me a minute.
secrets of the day. Locked on to Eddie, they whispered his name. Caught in a tempest, a life gone insane. Down in the dark, where the sailor path runs, a set of keys hit the dirt under disappearing suns. A house key, a car key, lost in the rush. But the stage swept it up like a hand in the crush. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through the darkness, piercing the shroud. 30 years in chains, but the truth won't die. Unseal the past, let Eddie rise high. Unseal the notes, expose all the blocks. Rayleigh trapped Eddie in a manufactured box. 30 years of hidden facts buried in the track. It is time to give Eddie O'Brien his freedom back. Unseal the box, break down the lock. Let the truth ring louder than the courthouse clock. 3 decades of silence, a cold prison shell. Refuse to lie, they cast a wicked spell. No remorse in their eyes, they judge from the booth. But Eddie stands tall, anchored in truth. Summer is opening, the science is real. The manufactured box begins to peel. Voices collide as hope takes its stand. With every heartbeat echoes a drowning band. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through the darkness, piercing the shroud. 30 years in chains, but the truth won't die. Unseal the past, let Eddie rise The drums roll thunder through the halls of despair. With strings and brass, they unite in the air. A symphony of chaos reflects in the night. The fight for Eddie grows bigger, takes flight. Beneath boundless skies, the walls start to shake. Each note of resistance, a wave in the wake. A revolution of honesty will cut through the lies. As the world turns its gaze, a new dawn will rise. So gather the voices who waited too long for Eddie O'Brien. We'll sing out strong. His freedom's a fire, lighting up the gloom. As the massive, triumphant clock brings truth to the room.
I tell you what, it took me like 3 days to study that Bud Weld, that Bud Weld connection. I hope I broke that down correctly. It took me like 3 days to figure it, like to really study that. You know, I was a little nervous about that presentation. My grandkid, I'm gonna have to get up and kick his butt. But yeah, we're talking about, Janet Downing, and I asked a question, did Janet get justice? Did Janet Downing get justice? I don't think Eddie got justice. I don't think Janet got justice. I don't think either one of them got justice. But Janet begged for a thorough investigation before she even passed away. She knew this was going to happen. And all she wanted was a real investigation. She must have foreseen this. Well, big shout out, of course. Big shout out to Denise for 20 gifted memberships. You know what I mean? We need a little siren for that one. Drum roll, an explosion, hot beats, and an applause. Big shout out for the 20 gifted memberships, man. Congratulations, everybody. Thank you, Ed. I appreciate that, man. Really makes me, you know, like finding the time, studying all this stuff and trying to do a good delivery. Sometimes we go for 2, 3 hours. It's not easy. Yes, make sure your memberships are turned on. Absolutely. Really appreciate that. Make sure the memberships are turned on. But Janet begged for a thorough investigation. Did she get one? I mean, after we look at, you know, some of the transcripts, some of the reports, the lab analysis, I mean, the police reports, what we're reading in this great book by Margo, that the police did not investigate the way Janet asked them to. Hey, look at that. Shout out to Regina Mahoney. Absolutely. Gina in the chat, welcome, man. Welcome. She's somebody who, this case should have been blown wide open. Just what she said. They didn't want to talk to her. They didn't want to talk to her. Welcome, Regina. Welcome. They didn't want to talk to her. They didn't want to talk to Virginia Reckley because it didn't fit their narrative. So I ask you, right? Did Janet get justice? Because we went over everything about Eddie, right? We went over the DNA. We went over the corruption between Riley, Wells, Bud, all that stuff. The blood, the prints, his lion ass little friends. You know what I mean? Why wasn't it Eddie that night, but it was Eddie when things went bad? Of course. We'll have to get her up on here soon, when things but yeah, Gina begged. So after everything, right? That's a tragedy inside a tragedy. When we get another 20 piece. What's up with that? At Denise, awesome, awesome. One of a kind, absolutely amazing, giving more people memberships, that's why, maybe when we start doing the interviews, we're doing nice members little only, to give the members, something to be a member about, appreciation. I appreciate y'all. Absolutely, man. That's 40. That's what's up. Off the cruise, feeling good. You get too much sun, you know? Garbage business is great, man. But thank you, man. You are awesome. You are absolutely awesome, man. I gotta get the noise, right? All the stuff. And we are talking about Eddie O'Brien and trying to break different stuff down every day, that proves he's innocent because the Amatol test, there's not much more that you need. The Amatol test, the lie detector test, even though the Amatol test, all right, it's inadmissible, I would rather you replace the damn jury with the Amatol test. I mean, the conviction rate might be a lot higher at that point. So I'm not sure if that might be good. I'm just a trash right now. Absolutely. I appreciate your trash. You know what I mean? And the 40 people that got them gifted memberships appreciate your trash as well, man. Feels good to be home. You know, we glad to have you back, right? Where is she? I was looking for my wife, but she's with the grandchildren right now. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. You know, and I understand why people are angry, right? That we're all talking about all of this stuff, you know, and talking about Eddie. But on the other hand, it's like, you know, they don't want this case reopened. But I kind of see, you know, and like I said earlier, how can the other side, you know, not question sometime in the 30 years and just sit back and say, you really think Eddie did this shit? You know what I mean? Another 20. Whoa. She's lighting it up. You know what I mean? Another 20 gifted memberships. We really appreciate it. That's 60. So, you know, people are going to be getting them as they sign in, you know, as they come watch the show. I'm overwhelmed, man. I'm like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. But it is, man. It's for something great, you know. We're gonna do something good for Eddie. I can't wait to have the Freedom Party. You know what I mean? But big shout out for the 20 gifted. Another 20, you know, wow. You know, I think that deserves some music, right? You wanna dance? You know, let's dance. Don't hurt yourself, you know, but if you can, move them chairs, down them tables, you know. What's the move? Let's go. Be easy. Now the time for everybody to go to givesendgo.com
Can you see?
PNACA.
Can you open the door to the voices
Like
unheard?
pretty much spelling that, right? Oops, spelling.
They knew the facts. Nonviolent heart.
Yeah, you go to the website we have up to speak about Eddie O'Brien.
Feeling not this dark fate, but the court turned blind and sealed up the gate.
For sure, you go to truthabouteddieobrien.com. You go over to the Help Now section. You press that, and the prompts are there. You know, you can donate on there, or also you can. I also have. Let me pull it up first. You know, if you want to get the T-shirt, you know, support Eddie's fight for freedom. Donate to his defense fund to Cash App. You know, $ Eddie O'Brien 6, or at Venmo at Edward-O'Brien-29, and they'll send you a free T-shirt or a tote bag as a thank you for a $30 or more donation for a T-shirt and a $40 or more donation for a tote bag. So, you know, and then all you got to do after that is screenshot your donation, you know, and send it to freeeddie-shirts@gmail.com along with your shipping address and the following information. For the tote, let us know if you want a black or white tote, you know. So shout out, I believe Sherry's the one handling that, you know, so shout out to her. You know, every bit helps to get Eddie to his Rule 30, you know, which is very, very important. And I believe Eddie's sister is involved in I believe Eddie's sister has a petition also, you know, so they have a petition, signed the petition, you know, help out. I think it's going to be a good summer for Eddie. You know, free Eddie, lock up Tom Riley. Absolutely, man. And big shout out to 2 cents for the $9.99. You know, thank you. You know, big shout out to Michelle for the gifted membership. You know, thank you, Denise Noel. You know, 43. You know, one of our great, great mods. So glad she's back from her cruise. You know, because a lot of things that you know, they want to make signs. They want to show up, you know, support Eddie. We can't wait till he actually gets a chance to go to court. You know, but back to what I was saying about did Janet get justice? You know, I don't think neither one of them actually got the justice that they deserve, Eddie or Janet. Yeah, sometimes I don't know if it's something with an iPhone as well. But I can understand sometimes why people are angry, you know, when, you know, we talk about this stuff. But I mean, people are angry on both sides. Like, I'm sure they can understand why people have been angry on the O'Brien side for so many years. I mean, and I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people probably don't want this case reopened because there's a killer walking around, you know? And I understand why families and neighbors feel attacked or traumatized or exhausted, but the O'Brien's been going through that for 30 years. Any other family might have gave up, you know, so I could see it on both sides. I mean, it's not easy. I'm sure it isn't comfortable. I'm sure it's definitely not entertainment. I mean, You know, we're not talking about this family to put them on a pedestal so people can point their fingers at, you know, and say that's the bad guy. Nah, I just had to throw that in. You know, so, you know, people point their fingers at because I'm sure Joe Bryan's been dealing with that for 30 years. And the only person who wouldn't want those questions answered is who? Who's the person that has something to lose here? You know, so, you know, I don't want anyone to think that we have a pointing at the victims because you know what? I think Eddie O'Brien is a victim as well, man. His life was taken from him. His you know childhood was robbed from him. He's you know when he does have the chance to get out, God bless him. You know it's gonna be you know it's gonna be hard for him to adapt to this life, but he has a strong family, you know, that's there to support him. He has a big support system. He has a lot of friends that is going to be overwhelming, and he has JoJo, and he's going to need everybody's support because when he comes home after this is flipped, you know, after 30 years, it's going to take some adjusting to do. You know, JoJo's going to have to, I hope he's saving his money. You know, I think Walmart, you know, they have cans. You can, you know, put cans in to, you know, save some nickels and stuff for the Capitol Grill, you know, big party. So, you know, but I feel bad on both sides, you know, but we need to honor Janet by doing what she asked for. She asked for a real investigation. She knew this was going to happen. She told Regina this was going to happen the day she passed away, and nobody wanted to talk to Regina, the person who was with Janet, what, the last 10 hours of her life, you know, but we learned in this case, justice isn't about convictions. Justice isn't about truth, you know, the truth doesn't expire. Time does. You know, time definitely does, man. But what she's investigate, investigate, investigate. You know, and that should stop every one of us in our tracks because on the very day that she was taken from her life, you know, the very day her life was robbed in a brutal way, unimaginable, something that takes time to do, something that Eddie O'Brien, no way in the world could have ever done this. Look at the DNA. I keep going back to that. You know, the print, whose DNA is there? There's someone else's DNA. You know, look what happened to Deanna. You know, she said, if anything, like what happened to Deanna ever happens to me, make sure the police investigate, investigate, investigate. That was her plea. That was her last request. And she knows it wasn't Eddie, and I'm sure she wants to rest in peace. I'm sure she wants to rest in peace. You know? I mean, you really got to look at the evidence, you know? You just can't read, you know, what popular opinion is, you know? Read some of the police reports. Go to the truthabouteddieobrien.com. These are the Commonwealth's own documents. This is their documents. You know, we're gonna Freebird help me break down the notes. We're actually gonna send it to Eddie and see if you know if they match up to what he has, you know, and we're also gonna talk to y'all about what the notes say. And the notes are very, very telling. You know, the notes are very telling. And we got them broken down to English this time. And but there's so many things that just stick out like a sore thumb. And it breaks my heart, right? And it makes my blood boil at the same time because what Janet begged for was never done. They took a young 15-year-old kid. They took a young 15-year-old kid, and they just robbed him. They put him in prison. He was forced to grow up and be a man on that day. And I know it, as tough as you try to be, them was some of Eddie's darkest days. Because I know as an adult, those were some of my darkest days. Shit, those are some of my darkest days, them first couple of days. Like, what did I do? What am I doing here? You know? Having his hopes up a couple of days before Christmas, ready to go home on bail. Nope. And we read in the book, I wish Ed O'Brien, maybe I can go back and read that chapter again because there's a lot maybe Ed could have filled in. What chapter was that? It talked about the Fifth Amendment, and maybe I can go back and read some of that again about the first transfer hearing. And I don't mind going over the first transfer hearing again if because maybe there are some questions in there that Ed could help us with. So if you all want to hear the chapter 8 again, the first transfer hearing is about the juvenile court transfer hearing that was known as Part A, in which the Commonwealth had to prove that there were probable cause to hold the accused over for trial. In Eddie's case, his attorney made it clear in his instructions to Eddie, in his comments to the court, that Eddie had a Fifth Amendment privilege against self incrimination and that he had instructed Eddie not to discuss any aspect of the crime itself with the evaluator. The judge repeated over the Commonwealth's objection that Eddie, in fact, did have the same constitutional right as any other defendant, and he directed the psychiatrist not to inquire about the crime itself when meeting with Eddie. Shh. Yep, the first one was in Little Ed's favor, right, with Heffernan. And I believe because of the Fifth Amendment privilege against self incrimination, is that why Riley was able to appeal it? Secondly, an important part of what is assessed by the psychiatrist, the level of remorse exhibited for the crime. Every time he could, the district attorney drove home the fact that the psychiatrist said Eddie expressed no remorse. God. I'm glad so many people have gifted memberships. And a lot more people are going to be getting gifted memberships, as they sign in. So, but yeah, man, but to continue that, it just breaks my heart. What Janet begged for was never done. The police didn't investigate. They rushed, right? They narrowed it down. They locked on to Eddie, and they never looked back, And in that rush, truth was lost. Janet's truth. So it isn't about relitigating pain. It isn't about disrespecting any families or reopening wounds for the sake of drama. It's about honoring something that a woman who deserved better, a mother, a neighbor, a friend. The O'Briens were friends with the Downings for 18 years. A mother, a neighbor, a friend, man, a person who asks for one simple thing. If something happens to me, don't let them stop looking. She knew that shit was coming. She didn't know Eddie O'Brien was going to walk through the door that night. No, she knew somebody was coming. What did one of the kids say? I know what they did. They hid in the house. I know what they did. They hid in the house. Little Ed couldn't display remorse. By definition, it was impossible. What he felt was sorrow, sadness, and loss. Remorse requires guilt. That's very, very good, Regina. Absolutely. Never sit. Try. Janet deserved more. Ed deserves more. The little boy ain't a little boy anymore. He missed out on a lot of opportunities. He still has a chance to, possibly, have a family, get out, have a normal life, and I really believe, like I said, it's going to take a lot, for when this is flipped for Eddie, to you know get settled back into things, because it's tough, being locked up for 30 years. That's all you know. But I think once he does, he's going to do a lot of good. I see him advocating for a lot of people, so I hope his Rule 30, I'm sure it's going to have everything in it. And after everything we talked about, everything we went over, and we're going to talk about the decision of the transfer hearing right now in chapter 10. But every stand-up guy I ever talked to across 2 states that did time and that knew of Eddie O'Brien had nothing but good things to say about him, that he was a stand-up guy. Anybody. Most stand-up guys that I talked to said Ed was stand-up. JoJo talks about it, right away. They took him under their wing, schooled him, told him this is how it is, this is what you got to do. His disciplinary record, there really isn't one, and these are places that sometimes you got to be bad. You know what I mean? Sometimes you gotta be bad, man. Bad things happen. You know, it could be normal walking around, walking to child, walking to the yard. You step on someone's shoes. You're walking to chow. You go to throw your cup in the garbage. Coffee splashes up. It splashes on the guy behind you. It goes bad that fast. You know, Jojo told you about when he had a beef in the gym. That could have went bad, and out of his peripheral vision, he sees Eddie got his back. Jojo's been a friend 20 years to Eddie. Hasn't seen him in 20. And still ride or die for Eddie O'Brien, man. You heard him yesterday. He got all hot. There was something he read, you know what I mean, about Eddie, and he was like a firecracker. I like that. That's loyalty right there. That's family. And JoJo came out here and he didn't replace Eddie. You know what I mean? He stepped in for Eddie. You know what I mean? He stepped in and gave them girls a brother. You know? Someone that they could lean their shoulder on, gave them parents, that son, not to replace him, but to be there for him. And I'm sure Eddie said, Jojo, look out for my parents. And he said, yo, that's my word. And Jojo has. For how long? That's loyalty, right? But we forgot that shit over the years. But I'm going to get into this chapter 10. The first transfer hearing spanned 9 trial days and ended on January 22nd of 96. Judge Paul Heffern, on the final day of the hearing, allowed DA Tom Riley to present 2 psychiatrists, Dr. Robert Kincherf and Dr. Donald Condi, to offer their opinions about the overkill nature of the crime. Overkill is the infliction of many more wounds that are necessary to incapacitate or kill a victim. It is suggestive of rage rather than panic, since the perpetrator, who is in a state of panic, flees at the first opportunity. Both psychiatrists felt the crime was sexual in nature. Downing's bra was cut 36 times, 17 in the left cup, 9 in the right cup, and 14 in the rear. These cuts didn't correspond to the cuts in her blouse or on her body. This suggests that the killer had removed her bra, sliced it 36 times, and replaced it. It was unfastened, but under her blouse, covering her breast, when the EMTs arrived. Suggests that the killer had removed her bra, sliced it 36 times, and then replaced it. It was unfastened, but under her blouse, like covering her breast when the EMTs arrived. Do you think someone might have ripped it off her? Oh, look at that. We got another 10. Can we keep it real, podcast membership? You are the best. You are the best. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Another 10.
Yeah. Well,
Condi was a hired gun who was a piece of garbage. And both psychiatrists felt the crime was sexual in nature. So her bra, someone said maybe she did find someone's stash and it was hiding in her bra. Who knows, but there's a lot of maybes. But you know what? We ain't here to solve a crime, right? We're here to get Eddie free. But that is crazy, man. Neither psychiatrist had interviewed Eddie O'Brien, his family, or any of the witnesses. So you never interviewed Eddie. You know what I mean? But you had all this shit to talk. They made it clear they were offering no opinion as to Eddie, his past or current functioning, or his amendability to rehabilitation. They agreed that the reports from Dr. Bonham and his associate, Dr. Field, provided no evidence of sexual violence or sadistic behavior in Eddie's past or present. Then how could that get even into the trial? However, the additional doctors were crucial to the DA because they enabled him to get his theory of the crime into evidence. Riley's theory seemed to be that Eddie O'Brien was a raging, sexually sadistic predator who had hidden his dark side from everyone in his life. That was quite a leap from the immature altar boy with no prosperity for violence and no motive to harm. Downing of the Bonham and Fields report just 5 months earlier. There was no dispute that a very deranged killer had murdered Janet Downing. The evidence was overwhelming, but Eddie O'Brien, a deranged madman? Eddie would have had to have been a highly sophisticated psycho to pass a lie detector test, go through a full battery of psychological testing, and endure 7 hours of interviews with a psychiatrist without anyone picking up any signs of mental illness. Right? He's got to be the slickest guy in the world, like, you know what I mean? Genius level. Pass the amateur test, all that stuff. Like, come on. More conspiracies. You know, the same guy that sold you, the same guy will tell you Tupac's alive, too. You know, but Judge Heffron took just 15 days to render his decision. On February 6th, 1996, he found that Edward S. O'Brien was indeed amenable to rehabilitation in juvenile justice system and ordered him retained in the juvenile court for trial. In his 12-page decision, the judge noted the corundum the defendant faced, any statements Eddie made to clinical personnel to support his retention in the juvenile system could be used against him in his upcoming trial for first degree. Heffron found it was inexcapitated by the suggestion that the rehabilitation can only be undertaken if the defendant implicated himself and demonstrated remorse for the crime, which had not yet been proven. What do you all think about this so far? The judge was attaching great weight to the forensic testimony. Let's see if someone has something to add to this. I want to see some comments about this. You know, I know Ed O'Brien is in the chat, and I know there's other people. What do you think about what we just said? Yeah, I'm going to play another song, and I'll be right back.
Innocence shattered in a world so torn. They said it was fear reopening the doors, filled with whispers behind closed floors. A white boy convicted made it look fair, but in the shadow of justice the truth laid bare. just a pawn in the game, sacrificed and railroaded. Nothing felt the same. Oh, just a boy from Somerville. They played with his life as if it was a thrill. Politics and pressure, shadows at play, innocent hearts lost in this twisted ballet. Barnum was under pressure, he folded like glass. The DA showboating, just trying to amass. The system wanted justice, but justice was blind, changing the laws, leaving truth far behind. Remove the judge who dared to be just. Eddie was demonized in the world's cruel thrust. Size mattered not when politics run deep. From day one he fought, but all they did was sweep. Oh, just a boy from Somerville. They played with his life as if it was a thrill. Politics and pressure, shadows at play, innocent hearts lost in this twisted ballet. And those inside knew the story was wrong. We could have done better, sang the old wrong song. Experts pressure to twist the truth arm in the court of despair. There was no charm, he never stood a chance from the very start. A tragic confession, a broken heart.
I love that song. You know what? That's a good song right there. Oh yeah, Heffernan even said, and I'm sure he suffers with the decision he made during that juvenile here. You know, but what we basically went over, is the judge listened to the doctors during that first hearing. You know, they looked at what the forensics experts said about Eddie. Dr. Kinship and Condi, but Condi was the hired gun, talked about general risk and treatment for kids. And we heard yesterday that, Eddie had to say, prove that he was amendable for a treatment program that they didn't even have, that didn't even exist. I have a short about that, but that was in yesterday's show. Eddie had no mental illness, no disorder, nothing that made him dangerous by nature, so this should have been a slam dunk in this case. Heffernan had every right to do this. But the judge basically said, Eddie's a kid, not a monster. But Riley, oh no. The judge believed Eddie didn't have a criminal history. You know what I mean? He had no violent past. He wasn't some evil or broken ass kid. If Eddie did anything wrong, it wasn't because he was born bad, or raised that way. It would be because he was a kid who made a terrible mistake, not a predator, not a monster, who made a mistake. In simple terms, the judge saw a child and not a killer like the judge was supposed to, because that judge didn't care about political gain. He wasn't there for that. The judge said Eddie should have stayed in the juvenile system. And this is huge. The judge decided Eddie should be treated as a juvenile, not as an adult. Why? Because kids can be treated, right? Kids can change. Eddie was born big, and I got a big boy too, man. Pee Wee football, he was going on 300 pounds. I know. I remember when in high school, his freshman year, he broke a kid's arm. He felt horrible. but kids can change. They grow, they can be rehabilitated. I know a kid, Montero, he's actually running the Rhode Island freedom, to try to overturn cases. Kyle, he was a lifer. He changed. You know, my boy DJ Lincoln, he was doing life. He's been out for a while now on parole. He changed his life around, has a family. Shout out to him. But this is opposite of what the district attorney wanted. The judge understood the difference between punishment and rehabilitation. At max, Eddie should have got a 20 piece. That's it. He believed Eddie fit the juvenile category, and Eddie was a kid that could be helped, not thrown in the garbage. Like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, you know what I mean? Should we just throw him away? I mean, it was a massive difference between having this juvenile hearing or waving him over to the adult side. I mean, if Eddie stayed in juvenile court and was found delinquent, he'd stay in youth facility until 21. Right then, serve 15 more years in adult prison. I mean, he would have been out when he was like 35, 36 maybe, if my math is right. But if Eddie's tried as an adult, guess what? He's facing life. No treatment, no rehabilitation, no second chances. But guess what? Eddie didn't have to do all them classes, but he did. For Riley, it wasn't about Janet. It was about political ambition and changing the juvenile laws. Absolutely. And we went, yep, absolutely. And he's absolutely right. But because Eddie, facing life, no rehabilitation, no second chance, the judge believed the juvenile route made more sense, and it absolutely did. Not only he was going with the law, he had compassion about it. And I get asked the question, and I always say, they said, Mike, but you're so sure on your free Eddie, but what if, you found out that, Eddie did commit this crime? And I said, okay, I'll play along. If I found out Eddie committed this crime, I still believe that Eddie should be free. Based on, I don't believe the juvenile hearing was right. I think they violated his rights. I think the first hearing, he should have been tried as a juvenile. He should have only served 20-year max. According to the law, he has 30 years in. So, yes, Eddie has plenty of time. He's been a model inmate. His disciplinary record has been, beautiful. He has shown no signs of violence. I think he had one, and basically, he's in the middle of the mix, so, and that was probably one of the only problems. A cell phone too, like, come on. It's every inmate's dream to have a cell phone. I mean, like, think about it. I mean, you're locked in, you're locked up, like, you want to have privacy. Come on. But other than that, his disciplinary record. So, yes, if I'll play along, like I said, and if I found out that Eddie was, that Eddie did this, yes, I still believe that Eddie should be free. And I stood 100 reasons why, and based on the law, he was violated, all the BS that they did to him, drugging him up, the test, keeping his parents away for like 2 years, George keeping Margo Nash far away from the legal stuff that was going on. I mean, everything. Yes, Eddie should be free. Yes, he should be out. Absolutely. But I don't think he he committed that. I just want to be clear. I do not think he did this. I believe in his innocence. And that's why I'm every day trying to break down something different in this case, and I just really, really want to fight and really try to help him, walk out of that place because he deserves more and Janet deserves more. Yeah, when my mom lost her brother, she still suffers, really close to her brother. You know, I mean, the judge said, "Look, this kid ain't crazy. He ain't evil. He ain't some damn predator." Yeah, where was I? All right. The judge attached great weight to the forensic testimony and evidence regarding dangerousness and amendability to treatment. He noted that the testimony of Dr. Kinsef and Condi, do not case specific, they didn't evaluate the defendant, was considered in light other forensic evidence offered by the prosecution. He ordered Eddie held without bail due to his potential dangerousness. However, he pointed out Dr. Bonham, after an exhaustive evaluation, concluded that Edward O'Brien was not afflicted with any mental illness or defect. The judge ruled that the credibility testimony regarding the clinical, social, and legal factors coupled with the security systems in place to deal with children found delinquent of murder, led him to believe that Eddie should remain in the juvenile system. My reading of this decision, Judge Heffernan was convinced that if Eddie had committed this crime, it wasn't because he was depraved and sexually sadistic predator. He was a child with no priors for any criminal conduct, yet alone the brutal crime. Therefore, in his opinion, even if guilty, Eddie was capable of growth, which will allow him to make free moral decisions when he ponders the enormity of his involvement and the ramifications. If found delinquent by reason of murder in juvenile court, Eddie would serve his sentence in a District of Youth Services facility, getting treatment until he reached the age of 21. He would then serve 15 more years in adult prison, a split sentence. He would be released at the age 36. If convicted in adult court, he would serve a life sentence without any possibility of parole. The public have been following this case on television and in the media for almost 7 months, and Riley had been promising them that Eddie would be tried in adult court and put away for the rest of his natural life. That's just horrible to somebody to even want that for a kid. Like Eddie was ripped out of his family and loved ones for political gain and to sell newspapers. I know, Big Ed. I know, and I am like, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that Riley gets to, like, I can't even. Never mind, because anything I say next would not be good. They all knew this and refused to be transparent. Because anything I say, it is. It's horrible, just to think if, like, I look at the picture of my son, I look at Eddie, and JoJo mentioned, looking at his stepson, at 15 and think, JoJo was like, I was robbing my first bank at 15 and You look at the 15-year-olds now, and it's just like, and for Eddie to be ripped out of his family at 15 years old, I mean, that's the next worst thing than losing your child, and it's just like, it's just heartbreaking, man. It's just heartbreaking, you know? And I can understand, how mad you was as a parent and, the retribution you wanted to lay and the vengeance and my goodness, if this was only gladiator times, things would be much different. Taking your son from you. So, I mean, and that's why I said in the last segment, it's heartbreaking for everything that your family had to go through and everything, that everybody, it's just, there were no winners here except for Riley and his, evil team. The public have been following this case. Riley had been promising that Eddie would be tried in adult court. Riley couldn't accept a 19-year sentence. His career was at stake. His successful prosecution of this case would lead to Attorney General's office, but he not be elected so publicly lost the juvenile transfer hearing. Supported by Governor Weld, Riley immediately claimed the Harbor and Copley Grant amendments to the juvenile law were proven insufficient. He filed a notice of appeal in late February 1996, asking the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court to overturn Heffernan's decision and remove the judge from the case. On June 1st, 96, Weld stood flanked by families of victims allegedly killed by adolescents and called on the Mass Senate to pass a bill requiring juveniles charged with this crime to be tried as adults. The public has a right to be protected from cold-blooded killers, and any system that fails to protect it is badly in need of repair. Janet Downing's father and brother stood with Weld and were quoted in news reports. On July 26, 96, after momentum grew for the bill following the Heffernan decision, Weld signed into a sweeping juvenile justice reform legislation mandating that anyone aged 14, 15, 16 charged with murder must be tried as an adult, and if convicted of first degree, must be sentenced to life without parole. Split sentencing died just 4 years after it began for children charged with first and second degree. While Hefferman's decision was being appealed by Riley to the Supreme Judicial Court, the governor, who appoints all judges in Mass, was publicly stating, in essence, that Hefferman's decision was a prime example of what was wrong with the law. That's right, a killer is still out there somewhere. Could a killer be in the chat? A killer in the chat. They failed to protect the law. Weld urged lawmakers to take these decisions away from judges who weighed all the evidence and considered all the factors. See what politicians can do? Even if you have a good judge that rules on the side of the law.
I'm sharing it. Sorry.
Okay. I have the Robert. All right, let me put this up on the screen. I have the report of the forensic evaluation of the parole board hearing. Okay, so give me a minute. We're going to put this up on the screen. Hey, we got a new member. Welcome, David. Welcome. Appreciate you. Let's see what I just have. I just received something, so we'll get back to this chapter in a minute. Oh, boy. All right, give me a minute. I'll be right back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Just a boy from Somerville with stars in his eyes, caught up in a game where the truth often dies. They said they keep it fair, but it was all a charade. Politics ran the case, and the justice betrayed. They pointed fingers at Eddie, just a kid with a dream, in a world that judged him harshly, tearing apart at the seams. So Eddie, they sacrificed you to make it look right, in a broken system where darkness swallows the light. With your spirit they played, just a pawn on their board. In the echoing silence, your name became a sword. Barnum was pressured, he folded under the weight. The DA was showboating, sealing Eddie's fate. They changed all the laws to fit their own design, removing the judge who sought a justice divine. A white boy from Somerville, caught in a cruel twist, while they painted him as danger, sealing him in their midst. Oh, Eddie, they sacrificed you to make it look right, in a broken system where darkness swallows the light. Yeah. whispers play. The door of the frame holds the secrets of the day. Locked on to Eddie, they whispered his name. Caught in a tempest, a life gone insane. Down in the dark, where the sailor path runs, a set of keys hit the dirt under disappearing suns. A house key, a car key, lost in the rush. But the state swept it up like a hand in the crush. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through the darkness, piercing the shroud. 30 years in chains, but the truth won't die. Unseal the past, let Eddie rise high. Unseal the notes, expose all the blocks. Rayleigh trapped Eddie in a manufactured box. 30 years of hidden facts buried in the track. It is time to give Eddie O'Brien his freedom back. Unseal the box, break down the lock. Let the truth ring louder than the courthouse clock. 3 decades of silence, a cold prison shell. Refuse to lie, they cast a wicked spell. No remorse in their eyes, they judge from the booth. But Eddie stands tall, anchored in truth. Summer is opening, the science is real. The manufactured box begins to peel. Voices collide as hope takes its stand. With every heartbeat echoes a drowning band. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through the darkness, piercing the shroud. 30 years in chains, but the truth won't die. Unseal the past, let Eddie rise.
All right, we back. I got it. I just read something. I want to bring it up on screen. 1 second. This just up on Eddie's website. Actually, it's from the 2024 parole hearing. And we're gonna break this down a little bit for you. We could say this is breaking, right? This is kind of breaking news, you know? This just up on Eddie's website. This is Dr. I'm probably going to butcher his friggin' name, but I'm sure that's okay. Where's my file at? Here it is. All right, this is Robert Kinchers, PhD. You know, this is the report of a forensic evaluation from a parole board hearing, you know, for Eddie O'Brien, John Cunha. So basically, you know, they're going to go over Eddie's background before the crime. You know, the doctor said that Eddie grew up in a normal, stable, loving family. Let's read it and then I'll break it down. Edward Eddie O'Brien is a 44-year-old. Can everybody see it? Hang on. Now you can. Now I'm going to give you guys a full screen so you could read this. Hang on while I read it to you. Okay, it says Edward Eddie O'Brien is a 44-year-old single-employed white male who is making his first appearance before the parole board on June 25th, 2024. Mr. O'Brien was 15 years old at the time of the homicide of Janet Downing on June 23rd, 95, in her Somerville home. Following 2 juvenile transfer hearings, he was convicted in Superior Court for first degree and committed to the Mass Department of Corrections on October 1st, 1997. A Supreme Judicial Court affirmed his conviction and sentencing from direct appeal back in 2000. His sentence was subsequently restructured to life with possibility of parole after the Supreme Judicial Court ruling in Dechekno Brown 2013 barring mandatory sentences of life without possibility of parole in juvenile homicide cases. Applied in Mass, the United States Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama 2012 that barred mandatory life without possibility of parole sentences for capital crimes committed under the age of 18. Mr. O'Brien became parole eligible in September 2012, but on advice of counsel, he postponed both that hearing date and another hearing in 2019. DOC records indicate that the Intex offense had sexual overtones that will require a DA review. It is my understanding that ordinary practices is to make a decision about whether to pursue SDP civil commitment only after an individual receives a positive parole vote. So we don't get too far. The doctor says Eddie grew up in a normal, stable, loving family, no abuse, no trauma, no BS, no mental illness, right? Behavioral problems, none of that stuff. He ain't a criminal. He ain't robbing banks at 15 years old. Right, JoJo? Shout out to JoJo. He ain't doing drugs. He ain't drinking. He's a regular kid. He's an altar boy. He's playing sports. Works. He's got friends. He helps his neighbors. He's a good kid. He's total opposite how I was. I was a good kid. Real good kid. Eddie's version of events still denies killing Janet Downing, right? His lawyers told him not to discuss details because he's still fighting for a new trial. The only thing he admits in this is he went into the house, saw Janet on the floor, bent down, tried to wake her, and left, right? So, let me see, we can go down here. I've been advised that the parole board will rely upon SJC case for official version and index. I have provided include a section of the SJC decision. For example, if beyond the score of forensic evaluation to address the factors and SDP review of possible civil commitment. Required conviction, justification of reason to sexual offense and index homicide was also charged, and the sexual offense also requires a mental abnormality of a personality disorder that makes it likely for the individual to engage in sexual offending, if not confined to a secure facility. Clinical interview and psychological assessment tool used Mr. O'Brien yielded no mental abnormal. So he's all right. He's straight. He ain't crazy. He ain't a lunatic. He no personality disorder either. He's normal. He could be a nexus for a likelihood. Really? At all, that could be the nexus for a likelihood of future sexual offender. Now, when you go down to development history, Eddie O'Brien is the second of 5 children born to married parents. He was reportedly born at Winchester Hospital, and there is no indication in available history of developmental difficulties or delays in available history. other than a mild stutter in early childhood. Me too. I used to stutter. That's how I think I started stuttering. Copying them, dude. So that's what you get. He describes a childhood without exposure to significant and traditional loving working middle class Irish American family. He had no history or special education, significant medical or psychiatric difficulties, nor problems with peer relationships. Indeed, Miss Downing was the mother of one of his best friends as they grew up together. He attended Catholic schools for his education, where he was an average student and invested in playing sports. He completed his freshman year at Don Bosco Technical High School prior to his arrest, where he also played organized football for the first time. Mr. O'Brien reportedly had no suspensions or expulsions from a school. See? Better than me, because I did. You know, I mean, I got kicked out of middle school and sent me to the junction. You know, it was a school for like kids with behavioral problems. You know, oh boy, now they put you on more kids that are messed up. I just found it wasn't even behavioral school. I called it a networking school because you networked with other people from all around the city that were just as bad as you. You know, but let's get back to Eddie. He served his local parish as an altar boy and participated in parish related community service activities such as volunteering to work with elders. He established good relationships with peers at schools with peers who lived in his neighborhood. Mr. O'Brien had no arrest or other involvement with the juvenile court prior to this index offense at age 15. His family had no involvement with the Department of Social Services, better known as, DCF. He was tested for possible ADHD at one point, but the results suggested that he was capable but not particularly motivated for academic learning. He has no history of counseling or psychiatric treatment in childhood. Mr. O'Brien reports is always working and did so as a paperboy, babysitting, shoveling snow on days when the weather canceled school. He began working at age 13 at a neighborhood convenience store and remained employed there until his arrest in July. Mr. O'Brien has consistently denied committing the murder of Miss Downing and has maintained his innocence over the years. Records indicate that he has been advised by counsel to make no comments about the official version of events at classification hearings and in anticipation of further application for appellate review of a request for a new trial. Counsel instructed me not to inquire about Mr. O'Brien's version of the events of the day of the homicide, and Mr. O'Brien was aware of that guidance from counsel. So, disciplinary summary. Here we go. Mr. O'Brien has incurred 7 disciplinary reports since his DOC incarceration in 1997. 2 incidents, 2007 and 2010, involved physical altercations with others, were largely for insolence of minor possession of contraband. He reports that he has a limited disciplinary history because he does not use alcohol or drugs, stays away from gangs and gang-related activity, and surrounds himself with like-minded people who are not about drama. Mr. O'Brien reports investing himself in his work, positive programming, and leisure activities and helping out others, including his advocacy for expanded programming at NCCI Gardner. I mean, in almost 30 years, he only has 7 reports. I mean, none since 2013, which is very impressive. No gang involvement, no drug use, no violence in over a decade. No violence in over a decade. He worked steady jobs. They said he completed tons of programs, earned a paralegal certificate. He earned college credits, right? He helped create programs for other inmates, restored a building for community use, right? Stayed close with his families, stayed mentally healthy. These are all the things that Eddie had going for him. Only 7 disciplinary reports. How about that? Oh, yeah, he didn't want no part of you, Big Ed. Absolutely not. Framed at 15. Like it's just crazy, like no gang involvement, no drug use, no violence in over a decade, had jobs, completed bunch of programs. He didn't have to complete any programs. He's doing life. What does he have to do any programs for? You know what? To better your mind. I'm self-taught. Everything I learned a lot in that law library, study, trying to learn for myself. He helped create programs for other inmates, restored a building for community use. I mean, that's all great. He did all them things for other convicts. And on top of it, for 30 years, his mind stayed fresh. His mind stayed healthy. He's still a smart kid. And the doctor said, Eddie has done everything a model inmate is supposed to do and more. The doctor gave Eddie multiple tests, right? The simple version, no mental illness. Um, the report said he had no personality disorder, no substance abuse problems, no signs of violent or becoming a predator, low risk of reoffending, everything going for him, strong support system, great self control, good judgment, all that stuff. And one test even showed Eddie is in the lowest 2.3 risk category compared to other incarcerated men. So, you know what that means? That 97.7% of the inmate population is a higher risk than Eddie. Imagine that. I'm going to have to put that in the chat. 97.7%. 97.7% of inmates are higher risk than Eddie. And then we get over to the, where is it? Let's see, contraband reports, there's a limited from history. The most significant disciplinary incident was in 2013 when he was found in possession of a cell phone and its accessories. At the time, possession of a cell phone accessories was regarded as an unauthorized possession of items or materials likely to be used in an escape. There was reportedly no evidence of actually planning for escape or attempted escape, and so Mr. O'Brien was never criminally charged with attempted escape, and the sanctions imposed were limited to a brief SMU admission and a period of loss of telephone privileges. The 2013 infraction was also his last disciplinary incident, a cell phone. And like I said, everybody wants a cell phone. Yeah, everyone wants to be locked up, wants to have a cell phone. You get locked in for the night, you call your family, you could do whatever. You could watch some YouTube, watch some videos, and it's not hard. You pay one of them guys a couple $100, $400 or $500. Cell phone coming in. Here you go. It's a brand new cell phone. But now check this out. We have a summary, right, of Eddie's his completed. Just make it bigger. Let me see. The Commonwealth, absolutely. Eddie's a good person who was taken from his parents, stolen his childhood, destroyed family lives, and absolutely. With that little twerp, Riley. Now, the summary of completed rehabilitative programs, the DOC records indicate that Eddie has completed or is currently engaged in the following programs. Legal assistant, paralegal certificate, alternative to violence trainer, library clerk training, alternative to violence advanced. He had them in 21 and 22. 2017, cognitive skills, active listening. I had that one. Book discussion 1, Toastmaster 2016, Jericho Circle 2012, Restorative Justice Reading Group 2018, Leadership Transformational Thinking 2022, Enlightenment Group for Life is ongoing, Reentry Seminar Service Certificate 2015, Alternative to Violence 2012, Formative Writing for Success 2017, Writing for Results 2016, Alternative to Violence 2012, Tufts University Inside Out Program 2018, Negotiating Workshop Certificate 2017. Oh my goodness. Unbelievable. Like all the great programs that he has done. And then the only other, so I don't want people to say, oh, you didn't say it all. There was another infraction that he had, a fight with another inmate who insisted on turning a unit fan off although the majority of the inmates in the house wanted it left on. This incident was described in Mr. O'Brien's submission to the parole board. The other incident was a scuffle with a correctional officer. Mr. O'Brien reports that both he and the CO involved considered it horseplay rather than a fight. So someone else probably wrote him up for that. The memorandum of appeal issued after a guilty finding the infraction notes that Mr. O'Brien admitted to ownership of the contraband item. IPS officers conducted an investigation and issued an IPS report, which found no indication that O'Brien attempted to use the cell phone in an escape. Records indicate that he had used the cell phone multiple times to call his parents. The list does not include programming where he was not eligible due to his lengthy sentence or risk status between 2013 and 2018, or was accepted but waitlisted. Reader is also referred to Mr. O'Brien's submitted materials to the parole board for a comprehensive list of his program's participation and documentation of successful ongoing engagements or completion. 2023 personalized program plan indicates that the following are not considered as need areas for him: academic education, anger, cognitive, behavioral, criminal thinking, emerging adult. He is considered low need by the Department of Correction for substance misuse programming. Medical records available through September of 2023 for his participation in the Life is Mental Health group described him as low risk due to stable mental status, distant, no history of, the S word, can't say that one, or self-injuries, behavior, minimal distress, available protective factors. Summary of course, detection, incarceration. Mr. O'Brien was arrested by state and Somerville police on July 25th of 95. A juvenile complaint filed in Somerville Juvenile Court, placed at the DYS Juvenile Unit at the Plymouth County Jail to await trial. While there, he was briefly involved in a brawl involving multiple juvenile detainees. He reports coming to make positive relationships with other detained youth, various of ethnical and racial backgrounds, and eventually served as a positive support as they crossed paths over the years in the DOC facilities. Oh, yeah, see? So it is true, He made positive relationships with other detained youth, variety of, different racial backgrounds, right? That because he was friends with them guys in the past, it served as positive support as they cross paths over the years coming up through the prison. If two groups had a beef, Eddie was kind of cool with both groups, so they would kind of be like, "Hey, Ed, can you go talk to these guys and then go talk to these guys, and because you're cool with everybody and everyone loves you, and you came in with all these guys when they were youths and now they're running in prison, can you make peace?" And Eddie goes and he makes peace. He also completed grade 9 prior to his arrest and continued to earn high school credits, although he did not complete high school while detained at the DYS. He developed an enduring love of reading while in the DYS. Mr. O'Brien also reports that he has accrued high school credits were eventually compiled and resulted in his GED. In May of 1997, he was indicted as an adult before Middlesex County Superior Court. He was transferred to East Cambridge Jail to await trial. Records indicate that while there was not a management problem, worked facility in the kitchen and received favorable unit reports. He was then transferred to Middleton House of Corrections, where he incurred no disciplinary reports. Not in the chat, right? And his parents remained supportive and visited him while detained at DYS at the East Cambridge Jail and Middleton House of Corrections. I mean, he was sentenced, transferred to MCI on October 7th for initial classification. At the time, he had no prior criminal history, no other legal notices. He was age 17 when transferred to DOC. Because of his youthfulness, he was an open mental health case until his transfer to the Sousa Baranski. His only subsequent mental health involvement was when he participated in the Life is Mental Health group at NCCI Gardner. He was transferred in 97 to MCI Concord, but administratively returned to MCI Cedar Junction due to his life sentence. Concord was like, nah. While there, he was employed in an auto plate shop. He got his first disciplinary ticket, destruction of state property, ripping a mattress. Due to a positive adjustment, Mr. O'Brien was then transferred he was then transferred to the Sousa Borowski facility where he received average evaluations. He was the target of a racially motivated attack in October 99, but remained free of disciplinary reports for approximately 2 years while working as a runner in the gym. He was targeted, he was racially motivated attack. Oh, man. In 2003, Mr. O'Brien was granted a lower security rating due to satisfaction adjustment and transferred to Old Colony Correctional Facility. He was there from February 2003 to November 2007 and worked as a runner and received favorable housing and work reports. He was waitlisted for several programs due to his sentence, but did not participate in any programs. In November, Mr. O'Brien was transferred to SMU at MCI Norfolk following a scuffle with a CO. He was released to general population there in January of 2008, where he held several jobs over the time. NIC member, runner for the probation unit, gym worker, and earned positive work evaluations. He was involved in the Needs Dog Training Program, Jericho Circle Alternatives to Violence, and completed the Computer Skills Program. Mr. O'Brien incurred 4 disciplinary reports while at MCI Norfolk, 12309, present in the cell of another inmate, where fermenting juices were found. So where they had a little bit of hooch. On April 18, 2010, fight with an inmate, possession of a radio with a broken seal, possession of a cell phone accessories in a cell. The last infraction was a cell phone, transferred back to SBCC in June 2013. It also was his last ticket report of any kind. That's also funny, man. Rating as a runner, he was denied entry into culinary program due to the risk rating resulting from the cell phone incident. He attended Catholic services, participated in Catholic sacraments, class and Toastmaster, attended AA, 12-step meeting, and was inmate speaker at the volunteer luncheon in May of 2014. He completed the reentry seminar Facilitated by former DOC Commissioner James Bender. Let me see if anybody has anything to say because I've been on the other page.
Mhm.
I know, right, Regina? 7 disciplinary issues in 30 years. I racked up more than that per month in high school. Oh, I know it. I mean, he was yeah, he didn't really get into a lot of trouble. Absolutely unacceptable behavior. Bullies at the system. All right, so let's get back into Eddie, huh? How about this guy, man? Crazy. Um, his January 2023 classification report describes him during his time at SBCC as continuing to actively seek programming opportunity and is always the first to sign up for any programs being offered. On the bottom, it says his disciplinary hearing. So basically, the big picture is they're saying Eddie was a normal kid, with really no history of violence, no mental illness, no sexual issues, no substance issues, model inmate. Then it goes through a lot of this. Right handed, where they even broke it down like his Catholic faith, what hand he writes with. He reports he and other inmates have petitioned faculty administration for permission to organize restorative justice and other programming to receive certificates for completion, such as mental health groups for lifers. Right-handed, full build, short crop, blonde hair. He came to each interview with a file case containing documents relating to his case, papers, pens, and a notebook. He's casually but neatly dressed and well kempt. He presented talkative, engaging, outgoing man with a wide range of emotions that was consistent with the specific topic under discussion. He has readily sense of humor, a keen sense of what seems reasonable and fair to him, and demonstrated willingness to advocate for himself and for others. There were no observed disturbances of either his form or content, range of emotion, short term, long term. So basically, I went to this forensic evaluation earlier while the song was playing, and it was prison record, clinical assessment. I mean, Eddie was weightlifted for a lot of programs because of his life without parole sentences, right? But back then, LWOP inmates were often not allowed into many programs, not because they didn't want to participate, because the DOC didn't want to pay for you to go. They didn't want to offer it to you because they felt it was a waste. So when a report says he didn't participate, it's not because he refused, it's because he wasn't allowed. So there was an incident, and a transfer back in 2007, right? He got into a scuffle with a correctional officer, right? So he was sent to SMU, which is Special Management Unit at MCI. Anytime, he's a lifer, plus he got into a beef with a CO, right? So he was released back to general population, in early 2008. And then he started working jobs, earning better evaluations at that point. So he completed programs at Norfolk. I think that was up here somewhere. He completed some programs at Norfolk. Once he was allowed access, you know, to participate in these programs, he was in the dog training program. I read he was in the Jericho Circle. It's a men's emotional group. Alternative to violence, computer skills. I mean, definitely educating his mind. So, it's good that they're allowing lifers, to do these programs. I mean, it definitely shows his initiative. I think it shows that he's maturity, his positive behavior, and he wants to keep educating his mind. So when he is released, and it kept him fighting for his case. And then there was another disciplinary report, in 2009 when he was found in the other inmate's cell. Fermenting juice was found in that cell. I mean, the inmate who lived there told the hearing officer that Eddie had absolutely nothing to do with it. Eddie's urine tested negative. You know what I mean? He wasn't drinking any of it. He was just there dropping off a newspaper. Bad timing. That happens a lot. And then in 2010, a typical beef, no pattern of violence before or after Eddie gets into a little beef, in 2011, radio with a broken seal, they don't want you doing that, it's just, it's a minor violation. And then, a couple years later, he gets caught with the cell phone in his cell. I mean, that's the big one, right? I don't know about the big one, but DOC treats possession of a cell phone as an escape attempt. So that's something you can be worried about with Eddie. I guess they would probably transfer you back to high security, but that label automatically increases your security level. The one incident is what kept Eddie from This one incident is what kept Eddie from minimum security. He was going to go to minimum security, but caught with the cell phone. So other programs, he couldn't go into the culinary programs, lower classifications, like I mentioned, the minimum security beef, but here's the key, right? This is why his last disciplinary report was 11 years ago, right? He returns to SBCC, right? And positive behavior, right? After the cell phone incident, he was sent back to SBCC. Even there, he got good work reviews. He attended Catholic services. He completed reentry seminars. He spoke at volunteer events. He joined AA. He was in a Toastmaster. He kept his head down, and Eddie stayed focused. And then, which was nice about June of 2018, Eddie's security risk is lowered. His DOC reviews his case and said he no longer needs level A restrictions. This means they no longer saw Eddie as a security risk. And then 2019, he's transferred to Gardner, and since he's been to Gardner, it's been great. He leads a volunteer inmate workforce to restore a building for programming. He works in in the weight gym with great reviews. He's taking college classes. He earned a business certificate. Um, very close with his family. He has a visitor list that includes, family, journalists, state rep, professionals, and he also keeps pushing for more programs, even the ones that don't give good time. I mean, he's doing it for growth, and not for perks. So, and then when you get to the clinical assessment, what the doctor described Eddie as very talkative, engaging, appropriate, very smart, fair minded. He was fair minded, he was a great advocate for himself. He didn't see any mental illness, he didn't see any problems. You he said Eddie came across as a healthy, stable, emotional adult. And the big takeaway, is Eddie has grown, they said, matured. He rehabilitated himself, his disciplinary issues were very minor. Some of them are misinterpreted, like kind of the fight with the cop and all that stuff, but no violence in over a decade. No substance abuse issues at all. He's deeply involved in positive programs for himself and other inmates. Strong family community, mentally, healthily. Like he has everything that you would think he needs for, to be released on parole. I mean, if you read all this, it's like, well, you got everything he needs. He's done everything the system asks for somebody who wants to change their life. But yeah, that was I can't imagine 17-year-old in Walpole. I know, imagine that. Incredible. But what you all think of that report? That was basically his parole report. We went through it, broke it all down. Um there's plenty that you can always catch up on. We went over Eddie's parole report from soup to nuts, his whole institutional record. What y'all think of that? Wow. What y'all think of that, huh? That was pretty interesting. Again, this was just recently put up on the truthabouteddieobrien.com. And it's basically, Eddie's whole institutional record, a report of a forensic evaluation, and it didn't sound bad at all, right? I mean, he did things that people do. I mean, who wouldn't have a cell phone? You know what I'm saying? Who wouldn't have a cell phone in the damn room? But I mean, we would all definitely have a cell phone in the room if we had the opportunity to. Excellent. So we went over a lot today. We went over chapter 9. We went over chapter 10. And it's about 3 hours that I've been on here, and I have work tonight, so tomorrow we'll get to finish this. But all right, give me a minute, and we'll be right back.
Oh, mm, yeah. In a world of black and white, we lost the shade. Judgments made with no thought, no faith in what could be said. Every expert that came said the same refrain. Eddie wasn't violent, he was fighting through the pain. Now the danger to the world, just a kid with a dream. They top the wounds and scars like it's part of the theme, but they missed the truth behind the voice standing tall, caught in a system that refused to hear his call. Every single expert, they knew the facts. Non-violent heart, it's not an act. He was meant for healing, not this dark fate, but the court turned blind and sealed up the gate. Oh, oh, and sealed up the gate. With every test and interview, they painted his soul, but that didn't matter. They had lost control. They looked at a number, not the man within, ignoring all the voices that should have helped him win. The purpose of the hearing was to guide him through, yet they tossed the science like they never knew. Too dangerous, too damaged, oh, that's not who he was. Just a child in a system without a pause. Every single expert, they knew the facts. Non-violent heart, it's not an act. He was meant for healing, not this dark fate, but the court turned blind and sealed up the gate. Oh, yeah. In the shadows of a house where the whispers play, the door of the frame holds the secrets of the day. Locked onto Eddie, they whispered his name. Caught in a tempest, a life gone insane. Down in the dark, where the cellar path runs, a set of keys hit the dirt under disappearing suns. A house key, a car key, lost in the rush. But the state swept it up like a hand in the crush. Eddie's freedom cry, can you hear it loud? Breaking through strings and brass, they unite in the air. A symphony of chaos reflects in the night. The fight for Eddie grows bigger, takes flight. Beneath boundless skies, the walls start to shake. Each note of resistance, a wave in the wake. A revolution of honesty will cut through the lies. As the world turns its gaze, a new dawn will rise. So gather the voices who waited too long for Eddie O'Brien. We'll sing out strong. His freedom's a fire, lighting up the gloom. As the massive, triumphant chord brings truth to the room.
Well, it's been a journey, people, man. It's been 3.5 hours, man. But before we wrap up tonight, I want to leave you with this. We spent the last hour basically walking through Eddie O'Brien's institutional record. Not the headlines. Not the narrative. Not everything else that we've been going over, but we went through the actual truth, of his institutional record, who he has been for nearly 30 years, not one dirty urine ever, 30 years behind those walls, only 7 tickets, Julian, not bad for 30 years, and the most serious one was a cell phone violation. So what does that basically tell you, and you want to strip away the noise, the politics, all the fear mongering, and what are you left with? It's simple, right? A man who grew up, right? A man who took responsibility for his life, right? Eddie O'Brien changed, he educated himself. Look at the record. Not a single act of violence over a decade. No substance abuse issues. No mental illness, no predatory behavior, right? None of that stuff. No patterns of danger. Eddie O'Brien, there was none of that to be worried about. He built programs, he restored buildings, he helped other lifers, he earned certificates, he took college classes. Eddie O'Brien, for somebody doing all that time, he has given so much back, and he stays grounded in his faith. He stays human in a place that's really made to strip away all your damn humanity, right? And the one big mistake, right? The friggin' cell phone, right? Was 11 friggin' years ago. 11 years of clean behavior since then. And people want to say, oh, the cell phone. Like, everybody wish they had a damn cell phone. Stop it. And the forensic doctor, I don't think he bullshitted anything. He didn't sugarcoat. He didn't write in a paper. He wrote facts. Facts that say Eddie is stable, Eddie is low risk, Eddie is rehabilitated, he's ready. But here's the part that hits the hardest, right? There's no science, there's no psychological, right? There's no type of behavior to keep Eddie O'Brien in prison, none. So when people ask, right, why are you still talking about this case? And I say this all the time, right? Why am I still talking about this case? Why won't you let it go? Why reopen old wounds? Why are you still going on every day? It's because, the truth doesn't expire. And, first there's 10 people, then there's 20, now there's 50 people. And if I could hold your conversation for 3.5 hours, with no one else's content, no one else's videos, I don't know, I think we're doing all right here. But we're talking about a human life. Eddie O'Brien, his life don't stop mattering because someone decides it was easier to close the case than to investigate it properly. And Janet didn't get justice, and Eddie didn't get justice, Eddie's not the boy they painted back in 1995, no. He's the man they don't want you to see in 2026, educated, smart. As long as I have a voice, right? As long as I have this community, as long as you all show up and keep showing up, right? As long as the truth keeps rising, right? We're going to keep telling the story. We'll have to keep asking the hard questions, We're going to keep honoring the people who deserve better, including Janet and Ed and the O'Briens and the Downs and everything that they went through. But we thank you, mods. We thank you, members. Thank you to this incredible chat family. And thank you for caring enough to listen, learn, and keep it real. I'll see you on the next one. And Denise, man, shout out to you, man. Thank you. Everyone thank Denise for all the gifted memberships today. I mean, what a great supporter of the channel, man. Thank you. Yes. Clap it up. Clap it up. Definitely. Give her a drum roll. Absolutely. Thank you, being a big supporter, gifted all their memberships today. What can I say? Big shout out to the new member, welcome, and 10 gifted Can We Keep It Real podcast memberships, and shout out to 2 cents worth, with the $9.99 free Eddie lockup, Tom Riley, thank you, and Denise pulls back with 20 Can We Keep It Real podcast page memberships. So 20 people enjoyed that gift, and then another 20 Can We Keep It Real podcast page memberships, and it wasn't over yet. Another 20 Can We Keep It Real podcast page memberships, and another $9.99, from a super mod, Denise Knowles. So thank you very much. Everyone thank her for your memberships. It's chatters and supporters. It takes an army, absolutely. I'm an OP. Thank you, Mike and Christina, Jojo, Arthur, Jerry in the chat. You're very welcome. We'll talk soon. Eddie, we'll get you home soon. Because, I'm dying to go to the Capitol Grill. But, all right, we'll talk later, man. One love. We love you. We out. Free Eddie, right? Free Eddie.
innocence shattered in a world so torn. They said it was fear reopening whispers behind closed floors. A white boy convicted made it look fair, but in the shadow of justice, the truth laid bare. Eddie was a name, but just a pawn in the game, sacrificed and railroaded. Nothing felt the same. Oh, just a boy from Somerville. They played with his life as if it was a thrill. Politics and pressure, shadows at play, innocent hearts lost in this twisted ballet. Barnum was under pressure, he folded like glass. The DA showboating, just trying to amass. The system wanted justice, but justice was blind, changing the laws, leaving truth far behind. Remove the judge who dared to be just. Eddie was demonized in the world's cruel thrust. Size mattered not when politics run deep. From day one he fought, but all they did was sweep. Oh, just a boy from Somerville. They played with his life as if it was a thrill. Politics and pressure, shadows at play, innocent hearts lost in this twisted ballet. And those inside knew the story was wrong. We could have done better, sang the old wrong song. Experts pressure to twist the truth, arm in the court of despair. There was no charm, he never stood a chance. From the very start, a tragic confession, a broken heart. Watch Eddie's face when the world turned cold. An innocent spirit caught in a tale retold. The system failed him, that much is clear. A boy from Somerville, lost in his fear. Yet in the ashes, his story remains of the justice betrayed and the bitter pains. Through the lens of history, we sing his plight. Remember the boy who stood up to the night. Just a boy from Somerville. They played with his life as if it was a thrill.